Following story is a translated and adapted conversation, recounting supernatural experiences from around the world. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only. Listen with an open mind and enjoy the thrill of the unknown. The content in this video is purely for entertainment. Viewer discretion is advised. If you are easily frightened, be prepared some stories might just send chills down your spine. If you're ready, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and immerse yourself in the world of the unexplained. The Rendlesham Forest Incident, December 26, 1980, Suffolk, England. The bitter cold of a post-Christmas night wrapped tightly around RAF Woodbridge, a U.S. Air Force base nestled deep in the English countryside. The surrounding woods Rendlesham Forest were silent, save for the occasional rustling of wind through skeletal trees. The soldiers on duty were prepared for another uneventful night shift, but then the sky lit up. At exactly 3 a.m., Airman First Class John Burroughs noticed a strange glow coming from deep within the trees. A brilliant white light too bright to be a lantern, too low to be a star hovered just above the ground, pulsing like a heartbeat. Did a plane just go down? Burroughs muttered to Sergeant Jim Penniston, who had also spotted the light. Assuming it might be a downed aircraft, the two men, along with another airman, Edward Cabansig, ventured into the forest to investigate. But as they drew closer, the glow intensified, casting long, unnatural shadows across the undergrowth. That's when they realized this was no ordinary crash. Hidden beneath the tall pines, the three men stopped abruptly. In a small clearing ahead, they saw it. A triangular craft, metallic and sleek, hovering just above the forest floor. Strange symbols lined its hull, glowing faintly like molten metal cooling in the dark. The air was thick with static electricity, making the hair on their arms stand on end. Suddenly, the object pulsed with a series of bright flashes, red, blue, and green, firing in rhythmic patterns, as if trying to communicate. A wave of pure dread washed over the men. This wasn't human technology. "It's not from here," Penniston whispered, his voice trembling. As Penniston approached the craft cautiously, a blinding flash erupted from the symbols on its surface. A sharp pain lanced through his head, and then, visions. Binary code. Infinite streams of one south and o south burned into his consciousness. Images of distant stars, unfamiliar landscapes, and civilizations beyond human comprehension flooded his mind. It felt like an attempt at communication, but the message was impossible to understand. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the craft shot upward, vanishing silently into the night sky. The airmen returned to the base, shaken and disoriented. Their superiors dismissed their report as a misidentification of a nearby lighthouse beam. But Burroughs, Penniston, and Cabansig knew what they had seen, and it wasn't a trick of the light. Penniston couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the symbols flashed in his mind, the binary code repeating endlessly. Something inside him had changed, something that couldn't be explained away. And deep within Rendlesham Forest, the trees whispered in the cold wind, as if the encounter was far from over. The cold morning sun did little to ease the tension in the air at RAF Woodbridge. Airmen John Burroughs, Jim Penniston, and Edward Cabansig sat in uneasy silence, their minds still replaying the surreal encounter from the night before. Despite their clear recollections of the triangular craft and its glowing symbols, the official stance from higher-ups was chillingly dismissive. "You were tired. You saw lights from the Orford Nest lighthouse," a commanding officer told them flatly. But they knew the truth. This wasn't just a trick of the light. As darkness fell once more over Rendlesham Forest, strange things began to stir again. Around 2 a.m., security personnel on patrol noticed lights dancing through the trees, brighter and more erratic than before. A decision was made. This time, Deputy Base Commander Charles Halt would personally investigate the phenomenon. Armed with radiation detectors, tape recorders, and flashlights, Halt and his team ventured into the woods. The chilling silence of the forest was broken only by the soft crackling of the recording device capturing every word, every breath of fear. "We're seeing strange lights through the trees now. Moving, pulsing." Halt's voice was calm but uneasy. "Radiation levels are spiking 3 times the normal background readings." Suddenly, the sky lit up with an intense beam of light shooting down from above, illuminating the entire clearing with a harsh, cold glow. "It's coming from above us. It's here," a voice shouted in panic. As the beam faded, the team caught sight of figures, shadowy shapes moving just beyond the edges of their flashlight's reach. Tall, slender silhouettes that seemed to glide effortlessly between the trees. Every attempt to approach them left the men disoriented and nauseous, as if some unseen force was bending reality itself. The recording device picked up more than just their voices: strange clicking noises, low-frequency hums, and what sounded eerily like whispers, though none of the team admitted to speaking. "Do you hear that? It's speaking, but not in any language I recognize." Their flashlights flickered violently as the temperature plummeted, breath forming thick clouds in front of their faces. The shapes vanished as quickly as they appeared, swallowed by the darkness, leaving behind a crushing sense of dread. By dawn, the official explanation remained the same: lighthouse beams and natural phenomena, but the men involved knew otherwise. Halt's tape recordings mysteriously disappeared from the official archives, though fragments would later be leaked to the public. Peniston, driven by the visions burned into his mind, began feverishly writing down the binary code he couldn't stop seeing every time he closed his eyes. Hours turned into days as he filled entire notebooks, unaware that the message hidden in the code would reveal something far more terrifying than any of them expected. Why was the radiation so high in the forest? Who, or what, were the shadowy figures watching from the trees? And why was the military so determined to bury the truth? The Rendlesham Forest incident was no longer just a strange sighting. It was becoming clear that they were part of something much larger, something that didn't want to be found. Airman Jim Peniston hadn't slept properly since the encounter. Every time he closed his eyes, the glowing symbols on the mysterious craft haunted his thoughts. But it wasn't just memory. Binary code began flooding his mind in waking moments, unrelenting streams of ones and zeros flashing like static behind his eyelids. Desperate for relief, Peniston began writing the numbers down in a feverish daze. It wasn't until days later that a friend suggested translating the code. Using a basic binary-to-text converter, the message was revealed: exploration of humanity, continuous advancement, planetary return date 8100, origin coordinates 5209 42 1313 12W. The coordinates led to a seemingly random location, an uninhabited island off the west coast of Ireland. But the return date 8100. Was this message from the future, or from something entirely beyond human understanding? While Peniston was consumed by the code, others who witnessed the event were suffering in different ways. John Burroughs and Charles Halt began experiencing strange physical symptoms. Burroughs developed severe heart problems, with no clear medical explanation. Halt was plagued by vivid nightmares of glowing figures and an overwhelming sense of being watched, even in broad daylight. Worse still, they received quiet but direct warnings from higher-ranking officials. "It's best if you forget what happened in those woods, for your own safety." Their attempts to speak out were dismissed, their testimonies quietly buried under layers of official denial and military secrecy. Driven by the mysterious message, Peniston and Burroughs decided to investigate the coordinates themselves. They traveled to Ireland, eventually reaching the isolated island mentioned in the code. There, beneath layers of moss and stone, they discovered something chilling: burned soil similar to the landing site in Rendlesham. Strange metallic fragments, unlike any known earthly material. A repeating low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate from deep beneath the earth. It felt like the same presence from the forest had been here long before them. Their investigation didn't go unnoticed. Within days of returning home, the men were visited by stranger suits with no names, asking too many questions and offering veiled threats. "You're digging into things best left alone," one man whispered to Peniston. "There are forces at play here that even your government doesn't fully understand." The message was clear: stop looking or face the consequences. As the days turned to weeks, each of the witnesses reported increasingly bizarre phenomena. Electronic devices turning on by themselves. Shadowy figures appearing in mirrors but vanishing when turned toward directly. A constant sense of being followed. The terror wasn't over, it was evolving, and whatever had made contact with them in Rendlesham Forest wasn't done with them yet. Weeks after the unsettling discoveries on the Irish island, the witnesses thought the nightmare was over. But the calm was only a fragile illusion. One cold, cloudless night, John Burroughs found himself drawn to an open field near his home. The air was still, unnaturally quiet until the familiar glow of strange lights reappeared on the horizon. The lights weren't just distant orbs anymore. They moved with purpose, spiraling through the sky, forming patterns that seemed like a language meant for someone watching. As Burroughs approached, his phone flickered and died. The lights intensified, and the field filled with a low, vibrating hum that settled into his bones. Suddenly, the lights blinked out, gone in a flash, leaving only silence and the heavy feeling of being observed. Meanwhile, Colonel Charles Halt stumbled upon something deeply disturbing in his old files and released audio recordings from that infamous night in Rendlesham Forest. On the tape, his voice was calm but strained. "The object is back, it's moving toward us now. It's beaming light down, my God, it's directly overhead." But the part never released to the public was far more chilling. Unintelligible static, the forest, it's not real. The ground is shifting. Do you see that? Another voice, terrified. "Sure, it's like it's inside my head. It's speaking to me." The military had cut off the recording before the most disturbing evidence could be made public, proof that the encounter wasn't just physical but psychological, or possibly even otherworldly manipulation. Obsessed with decoding the binary message from Episode 3, Jim Penniston began to notice strange patterns everywhere. Streetlights flickering in sequences that mimicked Morse code. Recurring numbers on clocks and license plates 8100. Sudden blackouts that coincided with vivid mental images of stars moving in unnatural formations. Penniston was convinced the message wasn't over. The binary code might not have been a warning but a map of what was to come. Just as the witnesses prepared to go public with their findings, they encountered resistance not from the military, but from a group far more secretive. Men in black suits, unmarked vehicles, and encrypted threats. "Your silence ensures safety." Others who didn't listen didn't last long. It became clear that there were powerful forces working to suppress the truth. Who were these people? Government agents, or something even more unexplained? As the paranoia escalated, a shocking discovery emerged. Similar incidents had occurred in other countries. Soviet Russia, reports of identical symbols found etched into remote forests. Australia, sightings of geometric lights over military bases. South America, entire villages reporting missing time and strange implants discovered beneath the skin of locals. The Rendlesham event was not an isolated incident, it was part of a global pattern. And worse, the timeline suggested these encounters had been happening for centuries. The final scene of the episode, Penniston's journal, shows a scribbled date, December 24, 2020, the exact 40-year anniversary of the original encounter. A final transmission appears on his computer screen, typed automatically as his hands hover above the keyboard. As the 40th anniversary of the Rendlesham Forest incident drew near, the air around the witnesses grew heavier with dread. Jim Penniston and John Burroughs hadn't spoken in weeks, both haunted by dreams that blurred the line between memory and nightmare. Bright lights, distorted figures, and voices whispering in languages no human could speak. The binary message from decades ago still lingered in Penniston's mind, but now the symbols were becoming clearer, forming a pattern, a countdown. And the final day was approaching fast, December 24, 2020. Meanwhile, Colonel Charles Halt began noticing signs that someone or something was monitoring him. His phone would ring at exactly 3:33 a.m., with only static on the other end. Unmarked vans were parked outside his house, disappearing the moment he tried to confront them. His emails were wiped clean overnight, replaced with a single message. "Do not interfere. Some truths are meant to remain buried." But Halt knew better. These warnings weren't coming from the government. The silence felt older, colder, like the forest itself had eyes that never blinked. Against their growing fear, the trio decided to return to Rendlesham Forest on the night of the anniversary. Armed with only flashlights, cameras, and sheer determination, they stepped back into the darkness. At first, everything was still. The tall trees swayed gently in the night wind, but then the air pressure dropped. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, save for the low hum they remembered all too well from 1980. A sudden pulse of light erupted between the trees, forming a perfect triangle in the sky. The ground beneath them began to tremble. This wasn't just a sighting anymore, it was a reawakening. Just like that fateful night 40 years ago, everything changed in an instant. One moment they were staring at the lights, then darkness. When they awoke, hours had passed. Their watches stopped at 3:33 am. The recordings on their cameras were nothing but static, except for a few chilling seconds. A distorted voice, metallic and hollow, speaking in broken English. The exchange is complete. You carry what cannot be returned. They discovered marks on their arms, small, geometric patterns burned into their skin, identical to those found on abductees worldwide. Back home, Peniston couldn't sleep. That night, as he stared at the marks on his arm, the binary code surged back into his mind with painful clarity. He rushed to decode the sequence again, and this time the translation was different. 42.0945 in, 71.493 to W, initiation site. The coordinates pointed not to Rendlesham, but to a remote location in Massachusetts, USA, a place with no record of UFO activity, or so it seemed. As the episode ends, Peniston receives a package on his doorstep, no return address, no note inside, only a flash drive. When he plugs it into his computer, the screen flickers with static before revealing grainy footage. A dark room, a figure restrained in a chair, barely visible in the dim light. A shadow moving behind them, tall, thin, and definitely inhuman. The screen goes black, and a final message appears. It never left, and now it's coming for you. As the clock struck midnight on December 24th, the air around Jim Peniston, John Burroughs, and Colonel Charles Halt turned thick with a silence too heavy to ignore. The marks on their arms burned with an unbearable heat, and Peniston's decoded message repeated in his mind. 42.0945 in, 71.493 to W, initiation site. They realized the countdown hadn't just been about time, it was a summons. The exchange hinted at in the previous recordings wasn't finished yet. The shadow from the mysterious video lingered in Peniston's thoughts, a constant reminder that something had followed them since that first night in Rendlesham Forest. The flash drive's final message, it never left. And now, it's coming for you, haunted them. But there was no time to run. That night, their phones began ringing simultaneously. Each screen displayed 3:33 am, but when they answered, they didn't hear static. Instead, a cold, mechanical voice whispered, "You opened the gate, prepare for the convergence." The power cut out instantly, leaving them in total darkness except for a soft, pulsing light that appeared just outside Peniston's house, eerily similar to the one they had seen in the forest 40 years ago. News broke the next morning that strange lights had been spotted across Europe and the United States. Reports from locals described the same triangular patterns in the sky and sudden blackouts. Entire towns in Maine and Massachusetts plunged into darkness. Cattle mutilations reported across rural England and Scotland. Unexplained disappearances of hikers in remote woodlands. The phenomenon wasn't isolated anymore, it was global. Determined to face whatever was coming, Peniston, Burroughs, and Halt traveled to the coordinates from the binary message. It led them deep into the Massachusetts wilderness, of forest that eerily resembled Rendlesham. As they reached a clearing, a sudden wave of gravity pulled them to their knees. Above them hovered a massive, black triangular craft, its surface shimmering with unnatural reflections of stars that didn't belong to Earth's night sky. A beam of light descended, lifting them into the air without resistance. Time seemed to stretch and fold around them, minutes felt like hours, and memories began to bleed into the present. Inside the craft, they weren't met with little green men but instead confronted with an overwhelming presence and intelligence older than humanity itself. A chorus of voices echoed in their minds, speaking as one. The exchange is now complete. You carry the seed of understanding. The visions they experienced were beyond comprehension. Earth as a fragile sphere in the vastness of space. Human history seen through alien eyes from ancient civilizations to the atomic age. A glimpse of Earth's future, fractured by conflict unless the message was understood. When they awoke, they were lying in the clearing, the ship long gone. In their hands was a small metallic device, pulsing with a faint glow. Engraved on it were the same symbols from Rendlesham, alongside a new binary code. In the final moments of the story, Peniston decodes the new message, revealing chilling coordinates. 51.9775 and 1.35570, return point, Rendlesham Forest, England. The lights, the abductions, the visions, it was never about Earth alone. It was a warning and an invitation. The message ends with one final, cryptic phrase: "We will return when the sky opens again." The screen fades to black, leaving listeners with a lingering question. What if they never truly left? The Allagash abductions. The dense forests of Maine stretched endlessly around them, ancient and silent, hiding secrets older than memory itself. It was August 1976, and for friends Jack Wiener, Jim Wiener, Chuck Rack, and Charlie Foltz set out on what was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Nothing more than for college buddies looking for adventure, peace, and the serenity only nature could offer. Their destination was the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, a remote, untouched stretch of forest and rivers deep in the heart of Maine. They packed their canoes, fishing gear, and enough supplies for a week under the stars, eager for isolation and the freedom of the wild. But none of them could have foreseen what would come next. The first few days passed uneventfully: hikes through the undergrowth, late-night conversations around the fire, and stargazing beneath a blanket of brilliant constellations. The sky out there seemed endless, the stars closer and brighter than they had ever seen before. But on the fourth night, everything changed. They set up camp by Eagle Lake, the surface of the water shimmering under the moonlight. To attract fish, they built a large campfire on the shore, a glowing beacon cutting through the inky darkness of the wilderness. With rods in hand, they paddled their canoe onto the lake, their laughter echoing softly through the night. That's when they saw it, hovering silently above the treetops. A glowing orb of light pulsed in the sky, a bright, burning object that didn't move like any airplane or helicopter. It was completely silent, its light shifting from a soft yellow to an intense, almost blinding white. The four men froze, their paddles dipping slowly into the still water, creating ripples that seemed too loud in the silence. Suddenly, the object moved, swift and deliberate, sliding across the sky toward them without a sound. Fear gripped them all, and panic set in. They turned the canoe around, paddling furiously back toward shore. But the light followed, getting closer with every second. As they reached the beach, Charlie turned to look back, and that's when the beam struck. A blinding ray of light shot down from the object, enveloping them in an overwhelming glow. The next thing they knew, they were standing around the campfire again. The fire, once roaring, had burned down to embers, though it had only been minutes since they left. Hours had passed. Time had vanished without explanation. Each of them felt disoriented, drained, and cold, but they didn't talk about it, not yet. It wasn't until days later that the nightmares began. Jack dreamed of strange figures with elongated limbs, cold eyes without emotion, and metallic tools that hovered in sterile rooms. The others, too, began to remember flashes of strange lights and sensations, unexplainable pain, pressure, and the feeling of being watched even in their sleep. They dismissed it all as exhaustion, stress, maybe just an overactive imagination sparked by the strange lights they had seen. But deep down, each of them knew something was wrong. Something had followed them out of those woods. And the marks on their bodies, those were just the beginning. The men returned to their normal lives after leaving the wilderness of Maine, but the shadows of that night followed them. It wasn't just the unsettling silence or the strange beam of light. They couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened during those missing hours around the campfire. Weeks passed, and the nightmares grew worse. Jack Wiener woke up drenched in sweat, images of pale figures looming over him seared into his mind. Long, thin fingers reached toward his face, and his dreams cold, emotionless beings with large, black eyes staring deep into his soul. The dreams were too vivid, too real to dismiss as mere imagination. His brother, Jim, began to experience something even stranger, flashes of light in the corner of his vision during the day, and at night, the sensation of being paralyzed, unable to move, but completely aware of his surroundings. He described the feeling of being held down by an unseen force, as though something was watching, waiting in the darkness. But the worst revelation came when they all compared the strange marks on their bodies. Chuck noticed them first: small, circular burns on his wrist, almost like puncture wounds that had healed too quickly. Charlie had similar marks on his ankle. When they finally gathered together to talk about it, the pieces of the puzzle began to form a terrifying picture. It wasn't until Jim suggested hypnosis therapy that they considered the idea that something had truly happened to them, something beyond their understanding. Skeptical but desperate for answers, they sought out a professional hypnotherapist known for working with trauma victims. What surfaced during those sessions was beyond anything they could have expected. Under hypnosis, Jack recalled floating in a cold, sterile room. The walls were metallic, smooth, and pulsing faintly with a bluish glow. He described lying on a table, unable to move, while beings tall, with thin gray skin and enormous black eyes examined him. They didn't speak, but their thoughts echoed directly into his mind, emotionless and clinical. Jim, too, described similar scenes: bright, blinding lights, instruments cutting through the silence, and the overwhelming sense of being a specimen rather than a person. They all spoke of the same faceless creatures, moving in complete silence but communicating with a cold, invasive telepathy that sent shivers down their spines even under hypnosis. But it wasn't just the abduction, they remembered it was the purpose. In one terrifying memory, Charlie recalled hearing the creatures say in his mind, not out loud, "They are not ready yet." Ready for what? None of them knew. After those sessions, their lives unraveled further. Electronics malfunctioned around them, lights flickering, TVs cutting out, radios filled with static whenever they passed by. Worse still, they started to feel watched. Shadows would flicker at the edges of their vision, and they constantly sensed a presence nearby. The group couldn't deny it any longer. Whatever had taken them that night on Eagle Lake wasn't finished with them yet. And the real horror, the realization that the Allagash incident might not have been their first encounter. The days after their hypnosis sessions felt heavier, thick with dread, as though the very air around them had changed. The four men tried to move on with their lives, but the memories unearthed under hypnosis clung to them like smoke. Jack Weiner was the first to crack. He stopped sleeping altogether, terrified of what might happen if he let his guard down. Every time he closed his eyes, they were waiting for him in the dark, the tall, gray figures, their cold, black eyes staring deep into his soul. Worse still, it wasn't just dreams anymore. One night, as Jack sat alone in his living room, the television flickered violently before cutting to static. Then came the sound, a low hum, deep and resonant, like an engine idling somewhere inside his skull. His body locked up, paralyzed by fear. Out of the corner of his eye, a shadow moved just beyond the edge of the light. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. Meanwhile, Jim began to experience missing time. He would wake up in unfamiliar places once, inside his car miles away from home, the headlights still on and the engine running. His wristwatch always stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m. No matter where he was. The worst incident happened one evening when Jim decided to record himself sleeping, desperate for proof that he wasn't losing his mind. The next morning, he played back the footage. For the first few hours, everything seemed normal, just him tossing and turning in bed. Then, at 3:33 a.m., the static began. The image blurred, and the sound cut out, replaced by a high-pitched frequency that made his teeth ache. A dark shape appeared at the edge of the frame, tall, thin, unmoving. The figure hovered there for several minutes before vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. The footage ended with Jim sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide open, yet completely unresponsive. He didn't remember waking up at all. For Chuck Rack, the terror took a different form. His paintings, once vibrant depictions of Maine's wilderness, began to twist into something darker. Without even realizing it, his hands painted long corridors of cold metal, blinding lights, and the eyes those deep, black voids that stared back at him from every canvas. One night, after finishing another unsettling piece, Chuck found a symbol carved into his wooden floor, a perfect circle with a triangle inside. Burned into the wood as if by an unseen hand, the room smelled of ozone and smoke. Charlie Foltz, the most skeptical of the group, tried to dismiss their experiences as stress-induced hallucinations until he found the mark. A small, circular scar had appeared on the back of his neck overnight, perfectly smooth and pale. When he pressed on it, a sharp, cold sensation shot down his spine. The following day, his phone rang. There was no number on the screen, just a blank void. When he answered, the line was dead silent at first. Then a voice whispered, low and mechanical, "We are still watching." Charlie dropped the phone in horror. The four friends finally gathered again, fear etched deep into their faces. They realized that whatever had taken them that night on Eagle Lake hadn't let them go. And now, something was coming back for them. The memories weren't the only thing they'd brought back from the woods. The four men couldn't escape it anymore. The strange visions, the unexplainable marks, the shadows that moved just beyond the light, every sign pointed them back to where it had all begun. Eagle Lake in the heart of the Allagash wilderness. It was Jack who suggested they return. His voice was tight with fear, but underneath, there was a determination born from desperation. If we don't face this, it'll keep happening. We have to go back and find out what they want. The others reluctantly agreed. Maybe they could confront the memories that haunted them. Maybe they could end it. The forest greeted them with silence. No birds, no wind, just the steady beat of their own anxious hearts. They set up camp on the same spot where, years earlier, they had watched that strange craft hover over the lake. The air grew heavy with tension as darkness fell. The moon cast pale beams across the water, making every ripple look like something moving beneath the surface. And then, just like before, the light returned. It began as a distant glow above the treetops, faint, almost like the memory of a star. But it grew stronger, brighter, until it bathed the entire camp in an unnatural silver-blue glare. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. The hum had returned too low and resonant, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Suddenly, Chuck doubled over in pain. "They're inside my head," he gasped, clutching at his temples. His eyes rolled back, and for a second, it seemed like something else was trying to speak through him. "Return to the water." The voice wasn't Chuck's. It was cold, mechanical, alien. Against every instinct screaming at them to run, the men followed the voice's command. They approached the lake's edge, the water still and black beneath the otherworldly glow. That's when Charlie noticed something below the surface. A faint shape, a perfect circle etched into the lakebed. The same symbol that had appeared burned into Chuck's floor. Without thinking, Jim waded into the freezing water, drawn by something beyond his control. The moment his fingers touched the submerged symbol, a wave of memories surged through all four men simultaneously. Metallic walls, blinding white lights, the sensation of floating without weight. Cold instruments slicing into flesh without leaving blood. But the worst memory wasn't the pain. It was the realization that they were never alone. The dark figures had been watching them long before the night at Eagle Lake. The light above the lake pulsed violently, and the hum turned into a deafening roar. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light blinked out, leaving them in total darkness. But now, each man felt something inside them shift, a lingering presence, as if something had been left behind. Jack's voice broke the silence. I think we've been marked." A low vibration traveled through the ground beneath their feet. The water in the lake rippled without wind. Something deep beneath the surface had awakened. And it wasn't finished with them yet. The men left Eagle Lake with a hollow silence between them. Each of them felt it, the cold, invisible hand that seemed to cling to their thoughts, twisting every memory into something darker. They hadn't just returned to the site of their nightmare. They had brought something back with them. Days after leaving the wilderness, Jack was the first to notice it. Beneath the dim light of his bathroom mirror, just below his collarbone, there was a faint, circular mark, the same shape they had seen beneath the water. A dull ache pulsed through the mark whenever he touched it, like a warning. It wasn't just a dream, Jack whispered to himself. It's real. They're real. The others soon found similar marks in identical locations: Jim's on his back, Chuck's on his left wrist, and Charlie's just below his jawline. The marks weren't wounds. They were symbols burned into their skin, as if by some precise, non-human tool. But it wasn't just physical pain that plagued them. Their dreams became battlegrounds, visions of endless, sterile hallways flooded with blinding white light, faceless shadows standing over them, cold, mechanical hands probing their minds. And then the nosebleeds started. One night, while flipping through late-night static on his TV, Charlie heard it again. Return complete, the message. The voice cut through the white noise like a shard of glass, distorted but familiar, echoing from that night by the lake. It wasn't random static anymore. It was a signal. Desperate for answers, the group reunited, comparing their experiences. Every detail matched, the same dreams, the same voices, the same feeling that they were being watched. They're not done with us, Chuck muttered, voice low with fear. They marked us for something bigger. Days later, Jim vanished. No signs of struggle, no messages left behind. Just his car, parked on the side of a deserted road near the edge of the forest, its door still open, engine cold. Inside the car, the others found something chilling. A hand-drawn symbol matching the marks on their bodies, sprawled violently across the dashboard. A small, circular burn mark on the seat, as if something or someone had pulled him straight out of the vehicle. We're being hunted, Jack whispered. and now they're taking us one by one. That night, Jack awoke with a start. His mark was glowing faintly in the dark, pulsing like a heartbeat. A cold realization settled over him. It wasn't just a mark, it was a timer. Each pulse grew stronger, faster, like a countdown ticking toward an inevitable end. As shadows crept along the walls of his room, Jack knew one horrifying truth. The abductions weren't over, they had only just begun. The countdown had begun. For Jack, Chuck, and Charlie, every passing moment felt like standing on the edge of a bottomless void waiting for something unspeakable to pull them in. Jim was already gone, and they feared they'd be next. But they weren't ready to give up. Not yet. Desperate for answers, the remaining three turned to hypnosis regression therapy, a way to unlock the memories buried deep within their subconscious. Each of them knew something had been taken from their minds that night by the lake. The sessions unearthed something horrifying. Jack recalled bright lights slicing through the darkness and the sensation of being lifted from the boat weightless and paralyzed. Chuck saw shadowy beings with large, black eyes, moving around him like surgeons. Charlie's memory was the worst. He remembered Jim's silent screams as a beam of light consumed him, his body vanishing into nothingness. The memories didn't just confirm what they feared. They hadn't imagined anything. As the sessions went deeper, the marks on their bodies began to reveal their true purpose. Under UV light, the symbols glowed in a pattern eerily similar to constellations but not ones found in any Earth-based star maps. "These aren't just marks," Charlie whispered. "They're coordinates." The realization hit them like ice water. They weren't just abductees, they were beacons, marked for future collection. A signal for something or someone to come back for them. One night, under a moonless sky, the air around their cabin grew unnaturally still. No wind, no insects, just a crushing silence. Then the lights returned. A brilliant, pulsating glow filled the sky, reflecting off the lake's surface like liquid fire. The same paralyzing force gripped them, pinning their bodies in place as shadows descended from above. The visitors had returned. Jack's heartbeat was deafening in his ears as a voice not spoken aloud but inside his mind whispered, "You've seen too much, you must complete the cycle." But as the beings surrounded them, something unexpected happened. Jack's mark began to glow brightly, brighter than ever before. A surge of defiance rose in him. "Take me," he thought, "but let the others go." The beings paused. The air shimmered as if reality itself was bending around them. In that moment, Jack understood. This wasn't about punishment. It was an experiment, a test. A flash of light swallowed him whole. The next morning, Chuck and Charlie awoke on the shoreline of Eagle Lake, disoriented but alive. Jack was gone. His mark, too, had vanished from their skin. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence anyone had ever been there, except for one thing. A small, glowing stone sat on the edge of the water, pulsing faintly with the same rhythm as Jack's final heartbeat. "He made the choice," Charlie whispered, tears streaming down his face. "He saved us." To this day, the story of the Allagash abductions remains one of the most chilling accounts of extraterrestrial encounters in history. Jack was never found. His disappearance remains unsolved, a dark mystery that lingers in the forests of Maine. And for Chuck and Charlie, every glance at the night sky serves as a reminder. The experiment isn't over. They're still watching, and they might return.
If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.